Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube. The stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks.
There's been a lot of discussion about the impact that loneliness has on our ability to have civil social interactions, the ability to hide behind the blanket of social media with our postings and discussions about other individuals. But what about our health? What do we know about the impact that loneliness has on our physiology? How does that impact our overall health? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
If we start looking at the research and the evidence that we have about social isolation and about loneliness, we have a host of various physiological effects that lead to the onset of non-communicable diseases, lifestyle diseases, metabolic diseases, things like heart disease, stroke, diabetes, depression and anxiety, dementia. There's even some indication that loneliness and social isolation can lead to early death. The risk here that we have to deal with, or the discussion that we have to deal with in terms of the risk factors as it relates to loneliness and to social isolation, is to first indicate what's the difference between those two things. Social isolation is when a person does not have relationships or contact with others and has little to no social support. Social isolation can impose the same health risks as someone who is feeling lonely, even if they don't feel lonely. Loneliness, on the other hand, is a psychological thing. It's a feeling of being alone or being disconnected from others, even if you are in meaningful and close relationships or have some ability to have a community of belonging. But the person does not feel like they have meaningful relationships. The person feels like they do not have any close relationships. The person does not feel like they have a sense of belonging. It's a psychological difference between what the person is actually experiencing and what the person is cognitively experiencing, what the person is desiring in terms of their ability to have connections. Even if that person happens to have lots of friends, lots of social interactions, they can still have a sense of loneliness. Loneliness and social isolations may be shaped by conditions within the environment, may be shaped by where they work, may be shaped by other factors within their life. The availability and acceptance of community and communal interactions that can take place is going to impact social isolation and the sense of loneliness. Where we have areas where we have high amounts of communal interactions, we tend to see less social isolation. However, there can be various types of people within populations that have a higher risk for having that sense of social isolation and that sense of loneliness that we have to worry about. People who come from marginalized and discriminated communities can have a sense of loneliness, even if they happen to have high amounts of community and communal resources available to them. People who have lower socioeconomic status can have a higher risk for sensing loneliness due to the stresses imposed onto them based off of their social economic status. People who live alone, people who are older, tend to have or may have higher risks for social isolation and feelings of loneliness. If we look at what the CDC has reported out, about 1 in 3 adults in the United States report feeling lonely. About 1 in 4 adults report not having social or emotional support networks for them to use. Those factors come into play when we start looking at the issues that are at play when we start looking at what loneliness can do physiologically and what loneliness can do cognitively. When we start looking at these two aspects, it's something that has been in public domain for quite some time, particularly starting in 2019, 2020. We started having to worry about the public health initiatives of social isolations or social distancing amongst individuals in an attempt to dissuade the spread of a communicable disease. That kind of heightened the alert to the issues of loneliness, the issues of social isolation, more than what has been readily looked at in the past outside of psychological communities, or communities of psychologists, I should say. And most of this discussion has focused on the ideas surrounding depression more than any of the other health issues that we just listed out, in terms of the impact that loneliness and the impact that social isolation happens to have on the body. When we start looking at this idea in terms of social isolation and in terms of loneliness on the body, physiologically speaking, it's a stress. It's a never-ending stress, and that has to deal with where and how we're able to interpret stresses within the body. And it goes into something that I talk a lot with my students when it comes to health and inflammation and immunity issues, or health and dysfunction in terms of neuroendocrine responses. Everything that comes into play in terms of our ability to interpret stresses has higher cortical or cognitive aspects to it, which means that we can think ourselves into stress and we can think ourselves out of stress. What ends up happening with loneliness is that we trigger this constant state of stress response. And because we're having a constant state of stress response, we're going to have a constant rate of production of stress hormones. A lot of the media press around this idea likes to harp on really just one hormone in this, and that's cortisol, which is a key important hormone in terms of inflammation regulation and inflammation response. And it's a hormone that we see a lot with non-communicable diseases, but that's only one of the hormones that's going to come into play here. The bigger hormone coming into play as relates to a lot of the physiological impacts on loneliness, or the impacts loneliness has on the body, I should say, is coming from epinephrine, coming from adrenaline. And that's because what we're doing is we're putting ourselves into a constant state of what Soleil calls alarm. And so this is where we have to go back and look at this Soleil's gas response, general adaptive syndrome, and the responses that we have to stress and how that stress is going to impact our overall health. And there are 3 stages to this response. The first stage is alarm. Alarm you can think of in terms of our high school biology class or high school physiology class in terms of fight or flight response that everybody talks about. That fight or flight response amps up all of our physiological responses. That amping up of the physiological responses leads to higher metabolic activity in certain areas and lower metabolic activities in other areas. It leads to changes in the way in which our cardiovascular system works. It leads to changes in the way in which our pulmonary system works. It leads to changes in the way in which our musculoskeletal systems are going to work. It's going to change the way in which our nervous system works. Because of the constant state of stress that we feel, that's going to lead to the next stage in this sequence of events. That's going to lead to a maladaptive response. And that's the key here. We're going to dysregulation. That maladaptive response leads to what is referred to within the sequence of events here as resistance. Now, resistance sounds like a good thing, where we're trying to resist the stress. We're trying to make the body more resistant to the stress. But the problem is that we cannot get rid of the alarm phase. And because we cannot get rid of the alarm phase, we have this constant state of stress going on, where we're going to start to pump out additional inflammation responses, additional inflammatory hormones. This is where we're going to start having changes in our immune functions. And so what's up happening, because we're in this constant stress, or the way in which we're interpreting loneliness or interpreting social isolation as a constant state of stress, we're going to be putting ourselves into a chronic inflammatory state. That chronic inflammatory state is going to lead to elevated levels of cortisol, elevated levels of epinephrine, elevated levels of inflammatory interleukins, inflammatory hormones coming from our immune cells. It's going to lead to constant elevated levels of hormones that are going to lead to changes in the way in which the blood vessels are going to function. One of the hormones that can come about because of this constant state of stress is a little protein hormone known as C-reactive protein. And what that C-reactive protein can do is it can trigger clotting issues within the arteries, what is referred to as plaque development within the arteries, or atherosclerosis within the arteries. That's going to lead to changes in blood pressure. By having changes in blood pressure, we're going to have a higher stress placed onto the heart in terms of its ability to move blood around the body, which is going to cause additional stress onto the person. And this is all stemming from that cognitive sense of being isolated, being alone. Even if I happen to have a large social network, even if I happen to have high amounts of communal activity, even if I have a community that is welcoming to the person, This constant state of stress, this constant level of high rates of inflammation can lead to the development of the chronic metabolic diseases. As the inflammation signals, as the inflammation hormones are going to cause changes in our metabolism, which is going to cause changes in the way in which we're using metabolites, in particular causing glucose sparing events to take place, which is going to lead to the elevated levels of circulating levels of glucose. One of the hallmark signs of having diabetic conditions coming into play is that chronic level of blood glucose levels. But it will also lead to changes in terms of hormone regulation, in particular receptor regulation at the various tissues within the body, which will lead to sensitivity changes, in particular resistance to specific types of hormones, which will lead to the anabolic dysregulation that is the hallmark of the non-communicable disease. And that's typically seen as we go from this constant state of resistance into the exhaustion phase of Solei's gas response. These changes that we see taking place physiologically will also be seen within the nervous system. The constant state of fight or flight, the constant state of what we call sympathetic signaling, can cause changes within the way in which the brain itself is working. Yes, cortisol will have an impact. Yes, having resistance to certain anabolic hormones will have an impact. But the other thing that takes place when we start looking at this idea as relates to the loneliness and the social isolation and the health issues that can come into play is changes within distinct neurotransmitters within the brain, within the cerebral cortex, and what's usually referred to as neurotransmitter pathways. These neurotransmitter pathways are coming out of areas within the brain that are usually associated with the frontal cortex, with the limbic system, areas that are linked to our emotional responses, which is where we have distinct behavioral changes that will come about when I have a sense of social isolation, when I have a sense of loneliness. That's going to lead to a lot of the cognitive issues that we associate with social isolation, with loneliness, the anxiety, the depression issues that come about due to changes within the dopaminergic or the dopamine neurotransmitter pathway and the serotonergic or the serotonin neurotransmitter pathways, where we see these changes within these pathways lead to changes in mood, changes in emotional response, changes in appetite, changes in sleep regulation, changes in the seeking of reward responses. These changes within those two dualistic pathways. So when we say dualistic pathway, what we're saying is that they're in opposite directions. So they act against each other. Where the dopaminergic pathway, dopamine, is an activating pathway, whereas the serotonergic pathway, the serotonin pathway, is an inhibiting pathway. When those two pathways are out of balance, we end up getting issues with anxiety and issues with depression. And that's what happens with the cognitive impact of the social isolation, is that these two pathways get out of balance. And because they're out of balance, we get irregular signaling within the brain, which leads to the changes in the mood and responsiveness to emotional state that is going to be exhibited with increased levels of depression, increased levels of anxiety, seeking of rewards, doing risky behaviors in an attempt to alleviate some of that imbalance, seeking out food, seeking out other substances to consume in order to get things back into balance, trying to get activation within our reward center to give us a sense of ease. This is where people who are in states of social isolation, states of loneliness, may start to binge eat, may start to consume alcohol or other types of substances in an attempt to get back into a dopaminergic, serotonergic balance point. The other, it's really a hormone more than a neurotransmitter that comes into play as relates to this state of anxiety, the state of depression, is oxytocin. And when we start looking at this impact on oxytocin, it comes from the imbalance that we see between dopamine and serotonin. When dopamine and serotonin get out of balance, the ability for the oxytocin receptors to be properly regulated starts to get out of balance. That dysregulation on the dopaminergic pathway, causing dysregulation on the serotonergic pathway, causing dysregulation on the oxytocin pathway, leads to greater senses of isolation, greater senses of loss of kinship, loss of bonding that is experienced by people who are in states of social isolation and or a cognitive state of loneliness. Other issues that come into play because of this imbalance is the change that we see within other excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitter pathways that have an impact on the actual anatomy of the brain. And it's an interesting phenomenon to think about the fact that this simple cognitive state of sensing loneliness or feeling isolated can actually cause changes within the anatomy of the brain itself based off of activation and inhibition of the neurons. When we have high amounts of stress taking place, we have high amounts of inflammation taking place. There is low growth signals within the brain itself. There's low growth signals throughout the whole body. But when we're looking specifically at the brain, one of the other things that comes into play is actual anatomical changes due to a disruption of the glutamate pathway and an overactivation of the noradrenergic pathway. This disruption of our activation pathways. So both glutamate as well as the noradrenergic norepinephrine pathway are activators. But the way in which they do activation is different. The noradrenergic pathway activates through as the reticular activating system. And what that system does is it causes global responses to increase. It causes global neuron activity to take place. It's part of that whole fight or flight, the whole part of alarm that's taking place. And because it's part of that alarm system that's taking place, that activation is not going to be focused to specific areas to allow for proper growth signals, proper synapse activation to occur. What we're going to get is we're going to get fight or flight. We're going to get fight or flight taking place within the brain itself due to this hyperactivity within the noradrenergic norepinephrine pathway. The glutamate, on the other hand, is about synaptic activity and normal neuron activity. When we're awake, when we're alert, we have high amounts of glutamate causing activation within the neurons, within the cerebral cortex, within the brain that allows us to be awake and alert. However, if we have too much activation taking place, what ends up happening is we start having changes in the way in which the neurons are interacting with each other. If we combine that with the impact that cortisol has and the impact that insulin resistance has or insulin sensitivity has on the way in which the neuron to neuron interactions, what's called the synapse, are taking place, combined with the changes in the dopaminergic and the serotonergic pathway, we start having atrophying of areas within the brain taking hold. The atrophying, the actual shrinking of areas within the brain, is linked with changes in memory responses. This is where we can have, as part of the cognitive set of things coming about from senses of isolation, senses of loneliness, is poor memory recall, poor learning. If I happen to be a student who's sensing this sense of social isolation, sense of loneliness, I'm going to have poor recall. I'm going to have poor memory. I'm going to have poor learning capacity. And it's not because I'm unable to do it. It's because the brain is under so many different types of stresses that it cannot do the learning. If I'm older, I'm going to have a predisposition to having dementia taking place because the actual structures within the brain, the structures within the limbic system, the structures within the frontal cortex, the structures within the insular body, the structures within the temporal lobe, all of those areas that are associated with learning and recall and automatic and autonomic responses all get disrupted. And because they're disrupted, I'm not going to be able to form new memories. I may inappropriately recall old memories. I may have inappropriate emotional responses to distinct situations. All of the hallmarks that we have in terms of dementia responses within older aged individuals. This change in anatomy, this change in anatomical connections between neurons is also seen within the limbic system, in particular changes that we see in terms of the hippocampus and the amygdala, which will lead to inappropriate emotional responses and inappropriate emotional regulation to distinct situations that we see. It's one of the things that comes about when we start looking at changes in terms of mental health that comes from the prolonged state of loneliness, the prolonged state of social isolation, where we start seeing altered amygdala responses in terms of the processing of fear, the processing of danger, where we become hyper-reactive to situations or things that we perceive as threats that should not normally be perceived as threats. It leads to cycling of loneliness within the individual, where it becomes harder and harder and harder to make connections with other individuals due to this hyperreactivity that we see from the altered functions within the amygdala and within the hippocampus, where we have excessive amygdalar activity and reduced hippocampal activity. This change in hippocampus and change in amygdala is also linked with those changes that we see in terms of the ability to learn and the ability to recall. We can also see changes in terms of social interactions coming into play here, in terms of patience for others due to the loneliness, due to the social isolation that comes into play. This is where we start worrying about mental health issues for the person, where we will start seeing greater levels of anxiety coming about, even in social situations that should not cause anxiety to be present for the person. It's where if we start seeing people who have loneliness, people who have social isolation cues, or people who are lonely, or people who express loneliness, or people who appear to have some degree of social isolation, this is where we have to start taking proactive steps in order to try to alleviate some of that social isolation. In terms of that alleviating issue, we can actually be proactive in this, particularly for older individuals who are more susceptible to having isolations due to physical limitations, where having communal exercise comes into play. Doing the group walking activities, going to the senior centers for distinct types of physical exercise. One of the things that can come into play as it relates to alleviating some of this social isolation, some of this loneliness issue, particularly as it relates to the stress responses that we will see, is the impact that physical activity has. And this is where the impact of physical activity can alleviate some of the stress signals, some of the inflammation responses that come into play, but it will not correct any of the cognitive issues without seeking other types of treatments or other avenues of treatments that we're not going to talk about here. We're simply looking at what is it that this loneliness does physiologically that has impacts on our overall health. And so we start looking at this idea about loneliness, the idea about social isolation, and why it might be dangerous to our overall health. It's about changes that we see in terms of stress response. And it's that change in stress response that is going to be the issue for why we start having health issues, why we start having dysregulation issues, why we start having dysfunction issues coming about from the loneliness, from the social isolation. Well, thanks for listening. Hopefully get a bit out of the conversation as it relates to what can physiologically happen in terms of social isolation, in terms of loneliness. If you have questions or comments, please leave it for us. We're more than happy to cover this in greater detail. Make sure you give us that big 5-star rating, give it that big thumbs up, let us know that we're doing a good job in terms of the publications. Please share with all of your friends and family. Make sure you're following us here on the podcast, as well as with the stuff that we're publishing on YouTube, the written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes that get published into Instagram and Threads. Stay tuned for further discussions in terms of how the human body works, and myths and misconceptions that we have about how we can go about being healthy.